Hello, I'm Jean Harvey. The objective of this presentation is to provide a first broad overview of the nature of complex service delivery processes. I will use airports as illustration. While they typically include some of the simplest services such as bookstore clerk, parking attendants, porters, they also include some of the most complex jobs such as pilot, air controller, schedulers. Airports are hubs and staging grounds where passengers, luggage, and crews are matched to an outbound aircraft and later disembarked from an inbound aircraft and reinserted back in their respective activity cycles. Let's look at this in a little more detail. The respective dynamics and operating logic of these four elements are vastly different. The system exists to meet passengers' desires to go places, albeit for many different motives. Wherever people go, they need to bring some belongings. Since luggage can be heavy, cumbersome, and potentially dangerous, people and their belongings fly in different parts of the aircraft, giving rise to handling and matching challenges. Crews have various costs, home bases, capabilities. For example, can fly a Boeing 777-200 LR. They also have preferences and constraints. Pilots must be given at least 8 hours of uninterrupted rest after a 10-hour flight, for example, or has 20 years of experience and thus first pick on our next affectation. Aircrafts are the most expensive resources of the system. Their cycle and schedule drives the scheduling and handling of the other elements of the system. An airport consists of various zones, typically including a peripheral zone, an access zone, terminal zones, the turf, that's the area between the runways and the terminal, and the runways themselves. The terminal itself consists of several areas, such as check-in, shopping, duty-free, food courts, VIP lounges, immigration, customs, luggage, gates, aircraft access. Access between some of these zones and areas is strictly controlled, creating bottlenecks in the flows and making a timely and accurate four-way match between luggage, passenger, crews, and aircraft much more challenging. This can be quite intimidating to the uninitiated. Each area has its own mission, which determines its particular ambiance, modus operandi, and navigation rules, ranging from the quasi-military, immigration for example, to the functional, waiting room, to the strictly commercial, duty-free shopping. Sometimes different missions come into conflict with one another, and one gets the impression that the well-being of passengers ranks very low in the priorities of those who design and manage airports. In some airport, the distance passenger has to walk makes one wonder if the airport was designed for aircrafts and shopping rather than passenger comfort. Judging by the current performance on luggage, for example, it certainly was not designed for that purpose in mind. So it seems that aircraft determines everything and passenger has to do what they have to do to make it work. What I'd like to do now is first look at the customer's experience as he or she navigates the servicescape of the airport, taking first a high-level view and slowly zooming into the customer experience itself with its sequence of emotions. Afterwards, I'll take a more technical operator view, looking at whoever operates the airport and what they have to do to make sure that the customer's experience occurs according to plan. Let's look at the traveler's corridor as he surfs the airport servicescape. First, of course, before he gets to the airport, he's got to plan his trip. Online travel agencies, airline reservation systems, websites, consolidators, meta search engine, and what have you. The travelers first travels electronically. Then he drives physically and gets to the airport. Parking area first, access the airport itself, outbound plane, flies, and of course all sorts of complex system and complex service delivery processes are at work here. Inbound aircraft, and same thing in converse as he comes in. From the airport, the producer's perspective, there's all sorts of administration that goes on, aircraft maintenance, a world of complex processes in its own right, inseparable in many ways from the aircraft manufacturers. Let's now take a look at the customer. They're not all the same, of course. You have backpackers, family traveling with young kids, with elderly kids, teenagers, small business people, people who pay for their own expense as they travel. They're a different breed. And then the executives, who gets everything paid for and don't even notice it anymore. These are market segments. What they do, what they need, what they feel, what they experience is vastly different from one another. And of course it is very important for the operators to know that, in order to be able to focus their service delivery processes on the right needs. The traveler's experience starts as he or she approaches the airport, trying to find a place to park. If it's an airport with which she's familiar, then that may be relatively easy. Otherwise, it may be a challenge. Then there's the looking for a spot. There's the smell of gasoline and the noise of aircraft taking off and landing. From there, you access the terminal. Crowd of people waiting up in all sorts of lines that you see from the back, typically trying to find out which is your own line, with very low understandable information, looking at arrows and boards and postings and announcement in a noise environment that makes it virtually impossible to hear. Then you go to a machine or you go to a person. If you don't like machines, better get used to it. They're here to stay. Go through, get documented, and move to the new environment of airport security, which is a quasi-military environment, as you can see here, where rules have to be enforced, procedures have to be applied, orders have to be obeyed. Courtesy is optional. From there, you gain access to the terminal. You may be seated, if you're lucky. Otherwise, better start running. You get access to the jetway, a cramped space, typically congested because input and output are not matched. You're released too early and there's a capability for admission inside that does not correspond to the capability for admission to the tunnel per se. So you get congestion in there, and air conditioning is not always what it should be. You get access to the aircraft, where everybody's looking for a space for their luggage, typically, finding their seat. Onboard personnel trying to provide service courteously and to enforce rule and manage conflicts as well, to a host of market segments with very different expectations and capabilities. This, in a 2-minute cursory view, is the customer airport experience. Let's now take a look at the producer's perspective. For the airport operator's perspective, an airport can be seen as a series of funnels through which passengers and their belongings are processed. Let's look at each funnel in turn to see the complete sequence. First, passenger drive-in. So you get an incoming car traffic, which is processed in the first funnel, producing a crowd of people with their luggage. This is the output, this is the input, and there's a transformation in between. This output becomes the input of the next funnel, which is the check-in funnel. The output output here becomes the input, and it's got to meet a number of conditions to be input into the next stage, processed into check-in, and output into documented traveler. These documented travelers, in turn, output becomes input into the security check process. Security is checked, transformation, undesirable elements are eliminated here. The output are screened, and presumably, hopefully, safe travelers. This output is input into the boarding, the jetway process. At the output of that, you get boarding passengers, and all that remains is the seating process at that point. One of the core processes of airports is the sequence of filters, and operations managers must manage that to ensure as smooth an experience as possible for the customer and a compliant performance as well, and a cost-efficient performance if you look at the shareholders of that as well. Let's take each of these filters and look what exactly are they controlling, because the transformation that takes place at these levels is a controlled transformation at the airport. Each of these filters is filtering a different type of thing. Payment for parking, identity, correct payment, luggage for check-in, prohibited objects at security check, and so on. These checks require different activities. Payment activity at parking, exchange of information, verification at check-in, search, physical search, invasive at times, is done at security check. So these activities are also performed by different organizations, different entities, who do not necessarily coordinate each other's operation very well. They are done by different type of people. Some jobs are fairly simple, parking attendant. Others can be much more complex, such as immigration information. Some individuals may be easy to process, others may be very complex and require very different time to process. And the time, of course, is important because depending on the resources available, the capacity of the filter will be quite different. Given the time requirement and the number of resources, people, machine, installation, equipment, you get a capacity and possible number of people you can process per time unit. If those are not level, then you get bottlenecks and you get idle activities while the bottleneck is overworked. And being overworked, make mistakes, of course. Quality suffers, as we all know. We will refer to this series of funnels as the airport value stream. When the transformations are being performed correctly, without waste of time or waste of resources, they are creating value considering the mission of an airport. Whenever there's waiting, defects, stoppage of machine, useless activity, conflicts of any kind, this is NVA, non-value added, out of the value stream. To anyone who wants to improve a process, of course, these wastes, these non-value added elements are prime target. This is an airport. It is very sequential. But in any organization, you get processes connected to one another. The input of one transforms into an output, becomes the input of the second one, who transforms it. Seeing the organization as a series of such transformation. Being able to isolate a specific element that is causing problem or that is a potential source of opportunity is called scoping. Delimiting the perimeter of a process, specifying its mission within the global systems context of the value creation as described here. This scoping idea requires some tools, but first it requires this general understanding of an organization as a chain of connected processes, rather than as units, organization, departments, organizational charts. This is the type of vision we must take from an operations point of view. And as mentioned earlier, an operations point of view is meaningless unless it starts with a customer point of view and a clear focus on a market segment and the creation of an experience. A process is a shared way of doing things in an organization. It takes inputs and uses resources to add value, transform this input into an output of greater value for a customer, internal or external customer. Processes create value day in and day out repetitively in organizations. It translates into a chain of commitments distributed logically in the organization. The two first tools that I'm about to present, the SITOC diagram and the FAST diagram, are fundamental to process definition and understanding. The SITOC delimits the perimeter of the process and defines the process. The FAST diagram decomposes the transformation into its basic functionalities or sub-processes. It gives us a zoom-in view that makes the process and its nature easier to understand. Let's take the example of the security check at airport to illustrate the tools. SITOC is an acronym. The letter stands for supplier, input, transformation, output, and customer or client. We define it by starting from the end. Customer. In this case, looking at the security process, or the middle filter in the 5 filters we were looking at earlier, the customers are board passengers and society. As you see, board passengers is a verb, a transformation, repetitive process. It is in fact the next filter in line. Customers of processes are often downstream processes, and a process is described as a verb, board passengers. In other words, check security produces an output that must meet the input requirement for the next process. And of course, society has a big stake in this process, including the passengers themselves, but as we know since 911, more than the security of the passengers is at stake. What is the output? What are we giving these customers? Well, we're giving them passengers and carry-on that do not represent risk. Starting from duly documented passengers with carry-on luggage whose risk is unassessed. Where do we get these passengers from? Well, from the previous process, the previous filter in the 5 filter series. Check passengers in. What is the transformation? Well, what's required to transform passengers with unknown risk into safe passengers and carry on? Identify and filter security risk. A process is always described by 1 or 2 verbs and an object. In this SITOC formulation, we try to apply the KISS principle. Keep it simple. In the following tool, the FAST diagram, we will zoom in to see what's in there exactly. The process begins when passengers enter security check area. It ends when passenger is released into departure area. Those are 2 points, a starting point and end point, which delimit the perimeter of the process. The major element that's missing now is the raison d'être of the process, or mission. A mission statement of a process describes why the organization spends resources, must spend resources on this specific process. In this case, my reading of it would be the security check process exists to check documented passengers and their carry-on luggage for any object that might constitute a security risk. To ensure compliance with all passenger and carry-on regulations. Prohibit access to any passenger or belongings that is not fully compliant. To proceed with as much speed, efficiency, and courtesy and respect as is compatible with this objective, while adhering to accepted search procedures. Every sentence is essential to understand what it has to do. And anyone who needs to either design, change, or improve that process must have a very clear idea of its mission before changing it. Let's now zoom into the transformation. Identify and filter security risk. That's a bit short. And the next tool, which is a functional analysis, will allow us to zoom in and understand a little better what it means. The acronym FAST stands for Functional Analysis System Technique. The diagram, the technique, starts with the transformation then. Identify and filter security risks. And it asks itself the question, how? Looking not for a detailed description of the current way of doing things, but rather for a logical and functional decomposition of that verb into its elementary components. For example, guide passenger to checking area, guide passenger through preparation, check the person, check the belongings, proceed to detailed inspection as required, deal with security risk, facilitate reassembly, release passenger. Those are logical steps, sub-processes, or functionalities required by the process identify and filter security risk. They are generic and universal. Any airport, any country that tries to do that will more or less have to go through these steps. How they do it specifically will depend on their specific choices. The difference between the FAST diagram and the process mapping that we will see a little later is fundamental. One is logical, functional, normative, generic. The other one is specific, detailed, descriptive. When you do a FAST diagram, you use your mind, your brain. When you do a process mapping, you use your eyes. You are a camera, looking and describing what you're seeing, not judging. It helps us make sure that the process whose perimeter we've outlined in the SciTalk is the right process that we want to scope, either for improvement, for design, for changes of some kind. The SciTalk clearly delimits a process. The FAST diagram confirms to us that it is the right scope for the process, for the purpose that we have for it. The technique then. Start with the T of the transformation. Ask yourself, how? You can further break open any of these level 2 sub-processes, as they are called. For example, check the belongings. How? gather the person's belonging, opens the person's belongings, check each individual item for security risk, place back each item in their container, close the container. This is a further decomposition to which we could go on with a series of how questions. Of course, at some point it gets to be ridiculous. And in fact, it forces you to become descriptive rather than normative, as a fast diagram should be. We can check the diagram by proceeding in the other direction from right to left with the question, why? Check the belongings. Why? To identify and filter security risk. And generally, we find that there is a when sequence. Logically, our mind will tend to go through a sequence, a time sequence. So the when question is a verification that we are not forgetting anything. This does not always apply. Most of the time, it does. An airport is a complex servicescape. It consists of physical areas, sounds, images, bits of information, equipment, technology, people of very different skills. Customers, client, passengers traveling through it are also very different in terms of their abilities, their expectation, their experience, their age, their mental capabilities as well. They are very different market segments, requiring different type of information for successful navigation. Thoroughly understanding the customer experience and being able to walk through the servicescape in the customer's shoes is fundamental for operators. A good operation starts with a good strategy, including good marketing, segmentation, targeting, renunciation, all topics that we will discuss later on. Then comes the systemic view of the value stream. Input to output, perimeters delimiting each, understanding the requirement of each process, and the transformation required by previous processes to meet these requirements. Capacities, resources, the specific differences in operating environment, competence requirements that vary, as well as the critical interfaces between these processes. And we have only looked at one of the core processes of airport. This is the beginning of a long journey. We have many more such videos coming that will discuss in turn more advanced tool, but you have an idea here of the purpose of it. Taking the strategic view, the customer, the market in view, and then the operations view in order to deliver the goods and beat competition in the end. Thank you. Service delivery systems include all players, clients, installations, technology, environment, and operating mechanisms. As the customer navigates the servicescapes, he lives an experience. Both the quality of the outcome and the quality of the experience matter. From the producer's perspective, the value stream is a connected chain of value-adding processes, the output of one becoming the input to another. The producer must maximize throughput, manage flows and bottlenecks, minimize costs, while ensuring a superior experience and outcome. Each process must be clearly focused on the task while ensuring global coherence in the service delivery system. The SITOC and FAST diagrams are important techniques to scope processes. There are two of several techniques, actually. Their correct use requires some practice, quite a bit. Key concepts discussed here: ServiceScape, customer experience, service delivery processes, chain of value-adding processes, process breakdown, and the SITOC and FAST techniques. Thank you.